What was your worst travel experience? An elderly woman died 3 seats over from me after 1 hour into a 7-hour flight. Going to Egypt and getting caught up in the Arab Spring. My parents got into a huge fight and decided they wanted a divorce on the second day of a week-long vacation at Disney World. It was the most awful week of my life. I was going to China to visit my father who works overseas, and at the time I was big into drugs and had a 15-hour red-eye flight. Now his company paid for business class seats, so I had a comfortable ride ahead of me. Not having to worry about being elbow to elbow with someone for 15 hours, I decided to have some fun. Packed my laptop, loaded up with movies and music, and dropped 3 tabs of Huffman bicycle acid. Getting it through airport security was a cakewalk. Slipped it in the pages of a novel, no big deal. As I waited in the terminal for my priority boarding, I gingerly placed all 3 tabs on my tongue. As the first flight, a 1 hour to Toronto to connect to Beijing, took off, the acid started to kick in. Slowly at first, but from the increasing waves of hallucinations I was getting, it was picking up rapidly. The first vivid hallucination I remember was the seat back in front of me reaching out and engulfing me. I don't know if I actually physically placed my face up against the weathered cotton, but I must have, because the fibers felt so real on my forehead. It was like I was swimming in an ocean of textiles. By the time the flight landed in Toronto, I was tripping face. And as I tried to decipher my boarding pass, I realized I had 20 minutes to connect with the flight to Beijing. In a panicked rush I sprint off the plane, only to find myself in an arrivals terminal I didn't know the layout of. Should have figured this out before being high, in hindsight, but it is what it is. Turns out the gate for my departure is on the complete opposite end of the airport. So here I am, flat out sprinting, carry-on luggage bouncing behind me. I think I might have clipped a toddler on the way past. It's possible. I don't remember. I hear my flight called out on the intercom as final boarding, and I'm freaking out. I finally arrive at the gate, show my boarding pass, and get ushered onto the flight. Being in business class, on Air Canada business class is the same as first class, so the seats are in the front. I had a wonderful reclining chair, and as I settled into it for the long haul, a flight attendant approached me. For the first time, I glanced around the cabin, important why business people sat on all sides, and a lone 20-year-old stoner occupied the center row. As the flight attendant opened her mouth, she spoke simple words. Globe and Mail, or National Post, sir? I tried to process what she was saying but couldn't. Her stern face slowly elongated towards me, accordion-like, until it sat mere centimeters from my own. The hair on her cheek mole tickled me. It seemed as though my entire field of vision was occupied by a giant, larger-than-life face. Her demonic maw opened again and more horrifying sounds came out, but what she said was sir. Post or Globe? I was terrified. I stammered out Post, which she handed me. I didn't read it. Takeoff was the most frightening thing ever. In fact, I vividly hallucinated a ball of flame engulfing the 777 as it disintegrated on the runway, but actually, the feeling of 220,000 pounds of thrust is fucking amazing when you're on the moon. As we reached cruising altitude, so also did my trip. I stood up, and opted for a quick stroll through the cabin. I passed through the dividing curtain between first class and coach, and I was greeted with 300 staring faces. That might have been the most terrifying moment of the whole ordeal. Every single face was identical. They all had thick, furrowed eyebrows, a low hairline, and the most intimidating scowl. I saw someone clench their fist and I whimpered and turned back. The aircraft was breathing, or so it seemed. The walls simultaneously pulled closer and moved further. At times I felt as though I was sitting in a warehouse-sized space, and I was the size of a speck of dust. But at others, I felt like the walls were pressing in from all sides. Airplanes are fucking weird, man. Don't do acid on them. I was traveling for work, had not been feeling well for several days. I had a sneaking suspicion that I might have appendicitis. Decided to try to fly home and would go to the ER as soon as I landed. Get on the plane, taxi to the runway, and sat in a ground hold for the better part of 2 hours. At this point I felt really, really bad. I was close to ringing the flight attendant call button and explaining that I needed to get off the plane. We were finally cleared for takeoff, and fortunately it was a relatively short flight. I landed and drove straight to the ER. 3 hours later I was in surgery to have my appendix removed. In hindsight, it was an incredibly dumb move to try to fly. If my appendix had ruptured mid-flight, well. Food poisoning in the Dominican Republic 2 days before my flight home. My first instance of it, I shit and puked so hard at the same time I blacked out on the bathroom floor. 10 out of 10. I was flying back from India after spending a couple months there this summer. I want to note that on the 6-hour drive to the airport, I'd felt some motion and altitude sickness, and maybe some dehydration, but nothing much had happened. After boarding, I watch a Bollywood movie. It was pretty good. So I eat some of the airplane food, and let me tell you, United does not know how to make Indian food. It was completely unpalatable. But it was also the first of only 2 meals I'd get over 20 hours of flying, so I ate it. Mistake. I took a nap, and woke up in the middle of the night, meaning that pretty much everyone on the plane was asleep, too. And I have to shit. I mean, I have to shit really bad. So, clenching my anus tighter than a vice grip, I climb over the 2 people in between me and the aisle, slip on one of them, and plant myself face first into the armrest of one of the chairs in the central seats. I then make my way to the bathroom, trying to play it off, like how cats do when they try to jump onto the counter and misjudge the height. I get in the restroom, pants down, sit on the toilet, and unleash the holiest of holiest. I mean, there was a little plug of solid waste holding it all in, but after that, this was just a thick brown liquid jet of ass juice flowing like the Ganges out my rectum. Every few seconds the stream would stop, and I'd be greeted with an enormous ball of gas. It sounded like machine gun fire and artillery shellings, but the war was only just begun. I felt something coming up my esophagus. I could feel it rising up, like some sort of chunky snake slithering its way up my throat. I opened my mouth and burped, which sent another gushing burst of old muddy water forth from my ass, but then the air stopped in my throat. There was something there. I don't know how many of you have spent a lot of time in this situation, but an airplane bathroom isn't structured right for what I was going through right then. I needed to barf in the sink, but the fire hose that was my anal cavity was still putting out the unholy hellfire of half-processed Indian food, so I did what anyone else would do, and stood up. I didn't vomit. I wouldn't say it was vomit. You know how when you open a can of something that's been frozen, and it just kinda slides out, but retains the can shape? I'm trying to communicate this perfectly, here. A gelatinous can-shaped chunk of airplane food slid right out of my mouth and into the bathroom sink. It jiggled a little bit. My ass was spraying all over the walls. And that's when the nosebleed started. I instinctively reached for the paper towels, which meant my ass spray was directed at another wall, but then I vomited again, more liquid this time, and all over my hands. I was worried that the inside of my nose would get infected with the vomit. So I start trying to hawk it up, you know, like how you can vibrate your soft palate and kinda suck it back down. And then I tried blowing it out. Which meant there was now blood, vomit, and shit covering everything. Everything. And then it all stopped. With a whimpering squeak, all was quiet on my southern front. I plugged my nose with some tissues and spent the next half hour cleaning the restroom. Then I went to sleep again. I was in Morocco with my parents and they started fighting. People were looking, it was weird. Then my mom stormed off 5 minutes before the boat left to Spain, where our hotel was. We couldn't just leave her, so we had to wait at the dock for multiple hours waiting for her to come back. Then we had to sit there all night because boats didn't go during the night. It sucked. Was in Germany a few years back when that volcano in Iceland erupted, and European countries closed their airports. Had to go through Poland and Baltic countries with Polish bus drivers who couldn't speak English, while watching Polish dubbed Forrest Gump on a loop for 24 hours. I took a transatlantic cruise back from the Mediterranean to the US on board a Holland America ship, because we thought it might be more fun than just flying back. As we were boarding, we were given notice that there was some kind of severe sickness on the previous cruise with lots of vomiting. Basically the whole ship had become a vomitorium. Elevators, hallways, walls, everywhere. Most of the amenities were shut down, including laundry facilities. There were notices that also said the ship was being deep cleaned to remove the virus or germs, or whatever the issue was, but I didn't really see many signs of that, as our room was pretty filthy. There was a layer of grime on the phone that made it look like it was never washed, the sheets looked dirty and stained, and that bathroom was mildew city. We immediately made demands to have the room cleaned again, and it wasn't much better. After 2 days on the ship, we started to hear about people getting sick on the cruise, and being quarantined in their quarters. I even saw fresh vomit in the hall. We were still traveling around the coast of Europe, and were at a port in Spain when we decided to nope the fuck out of the rest of the cruise, took the loss, and fly back home instead anyway. After 4 years in England, I flew back to the US into Charleston Airport. My friend was a no-show, so I rented a car and started driving home. So much had changed in 4 years that I had to stop at a gas station and ask for directions. The person was having a hard time, so I said, "What road takes me east? I can find my way from there." And she said, "Honey, if you go east, you'll go into the ocean." I was in Charleston, South Carolina and was supposed to be in West Virginia.